All right, welcome everybody. This is the class for Titanium and mobile development. With Titanium, it's kind of an introductory overview of what Titanium is and how you can get started developing for iOS, Android. They support BlackBerry, Windows, and HTML5 mobile web. So a little bit about me. My name is Alma Madsen. I work for a company called Lucid Software. We have a product called Lucid Chart, which is diagramming software in the cloud. I headed up our mobile applications a few months ago. We started it. We're still working on them, but we decided to go with Titanium to do both our iOS and Android native tablet applications. I love JavaScript and CSS. I'm responsible for all the UI and UX Lucid Chart, as well as a lot of the other features and products we do. So first of all, Titanium. If you're not at all familiar with what Titanium is or why you're here, Titanium is a development environment for, like I just said, for HTML5, for Android, iOS, BlackBerry, Windows, mobile applications. The big features and key things that Titanium boasts is that you have one code base, so you get a lot of code reuse. You're writing in JavaScript. They've got 5,000 plus APIs to interact with the different native applications, and they include an IDE that makes it really easy for debugging and packaging your apps, things like that. So there's a handful of different platforms out there that are designed to make it easy to write code once and have it deployed to all different mobile platforms. The difference with Titanium and most of the other ones that I've seen is that Titanium, you actually get a native application out of it. There's others like PhoneGap you may have heard of, other things like that you're actually basically writing HTML5 apps that get packaged into a native web view. But with Titanium, they have a layer between the JavaScript you write and the native application code. So this is an example of kind of the flow. So this little snippet in the upper right of code to create a new window. That's JavaScript there. You're calling into Titanium saying create a window. So their JavaScript API invokes the native code to create a window, which then gives you a window proxy, and they send you back basically a wrapper as a JavaScript object that lets you interact with that window, like setting titles, opening, any other properties, methods that has. Yes?
So that Titanium is a virtual machine or a container or something like that that runs on the device? So
it uses the device's JavaScript engine to execute your code. So your JavaScript code is running on the device. So anytime there's an interaction with the user, or you have an event listener, whatever that is, that's all getting run through JavaScript and calling over to the native components. So you do have a little bit of overhead. It's not exactly native. You're going to get slightly better performance writing in Objective-C or in Java. But the idea here is that you can write it in JavaScript, and then it calls over to create the native components. So you're going to get nice performance as far as animations. You're actually getting real navigation controls, the real native things. You're not getting, somebody else's version of that. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. So getting started with Titanium. Have any of you used Titanium before, or played around with it a little bit? Okay, a handful of you kind of. So this may look a little familiar. You go to Titanium, you go to Appcelerator. They're the guys that produce Titanium, and you sign up for an account. You download Titanium Studio. This is their IDE. this is basically a lot of what I'm going over today. You can get directly through here. I'm going to go through some other gotchas and things that we've discovered that have been helpful to us. But you download their Titanium Studio. They've got a Get Started here. This will help you configure, get all your SDKs you need for Android, for BlackBerry, for iOS. It'll make sure that you've got the right stuff configured and installed so that you can immediately just start coding and testing it on these devices. The second tab there is Learn. This gives you quick access to their API documentation and other videos and things that they have. Their API documentation is quite good. There are some errors with it. We discovered some working on our project and posted it back to them, and they had it fixed in a day or two. So they're very responsive about this project. And but generally speaking, we didn't really find any problems with many problems with the API documentation. Very thorough and very useful in getting things going and understanding what's going on and being able to accomplish what you want to. This third tab here in the Titanium Studio gives you some sample applications. That's one of the things we're going to go over today is their to-do list. Basically, you click that import button on there. It will download all the source files you need and set it up for you so you can immediately launch it. Once you have that installed, here's another image of what the IDE looks like. You've got this, debug controls, build controls, typical things like that, and this drop-down menu. You have debug configurations. You go in there. It's pretty easy and fast to set up. Whether you want to use a device or an emulator, for what version of Android you want to be doing, all that stuff they've made really painless. Then you select down here. I want to run this in my iPhone simulator and hit go if you're doing iOS. Here's an example right out of the box. I downloaded their to-do app, their latest to-do app yesterday, ran it, took some screenshots. This is what came out. Real basic list here. This is a tabbed interface. So on iOS, you see the tabs at the bottom with the to-do list and the done list. On Android, the native tabbed interface is the tabs are at the top. And you don't have the add button. So you can see iOS, there's some things that are going to be different about your application, like the add button there in iOS is up in that navigation bar or the title bar. On Android, you don't have that. You typically access those kind of things through a menu button, which unfortunately didn't work. So hence the sad face. I couldn't get the menu to pop up in the emulator when I was taking these screenshots. So there's some problems there. But anyways, this is what the screen looks like when you hit the add button on iOS. It'd be very similar in Android. You have a text field and two buttons, right, to create a new to-do item. You click on one of the items on the home screen, and you get this alert box with 3 buttons. Once again, these are different, and you can see what they look like differently, but the code for those is exactly the same, and I'll show you the code in a little bit to pop up these boxes to change the status of your task. And then this is the other tab, right, for the list of done to-do items. Okay, so looking at the code here, is that legible? Okay. So with Titanium, they have a file called app.js. That's basically like the main file for if you're familiar with other languages. This is what gets executed as soon as your app starts up. This is where you can do a lot of things like checking what version or what operating system they're using, and load different UI components based on that, load different templates, and a lot of that kind of pre-processing stuff you want to know before you get started. You can see that at the opening of this anonymous function here, there's this app tab group, list window, and add window. It uses require. If you've used require.js, you're probably familiar with this. Other applications use similar things of loading these JavaScript modules in there. This is just a path relative to the project directory. So UI/app tab group. That's going to load app tab group.js. And then it's grabbing that off of the exports in there. We'll scroll down a little bit. So in this app, what they're doing is loading those 3 components, also loading up the database layer so you can store your data. Then we're creating this tab group, this new app tab group. That's one of those components that we required there right at the beginning. And this is just a simple helper. We can go over to that. As you can see, it's a real short file. This is the app tab group.js. Basically, here you start seeing it calling Titanium methods. So ti.ui, create tab group. This is creating a tab group, and for all the parameters you pass into that function, it's creating a new window in that tab group for each one of them. That's all it's doing, is looping through the arguments you pass in, and then adding an event listener for when you focus on that tab, so that this tab group has reference to the active one, or the current tab as it's called there. So you can see here in main, back to main, they were calling that new app tab group, passing in these 2 JavaScript objects that define the 2 different windows that we have. We have the icons that we want displayed in the tab bar. We have the title of those windows, which that's displayed in iOS, not in Android. And background color, you can see a lot of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory. This activity property there is only related to Android. I'll talk about this a little bit more. The documentation is really good about going over what an activity is. You want to familiarize yourself with the differences between iOS and Android or BlackBerry. And they do a good job of helping you understand the core differences, how those applications treat windows, they treat processes, how the basic fundamental principles that differ between these operating systems, because, once again, you're using native components and you need to understand what's going on to really make an effective use of that. So let's look over at the list window. So this gets created from the tab group. Each one of those objects that it passes in gets passed into this list window that they've created here, and that is exactly as it sounds. That's our list of the tasks that we need to do, and then the other list of the ones that we've already done. Are you all familiar with JavaScript? Anybody not? Okay. So this is pretty easy to read. It's a lot of just basic. Here we're doing something different for if it's not Android, right? This is done parameter that we pass in is just something saying whether or not it's the done list, right? So, and then if it's not Android, then we create that button to add up in the top navigation bar. So for iOS, we add that button, and we add a click handler, which opens the add window, where you create a new task. And you see this kind of code a lot in.
Quick question.
Yeah.
How come an application like this, wouldn't you normally separate? You just have like 2 individual projects dedicated to each device, rather than having conditionals like check device type?
Yeah, you certainly can. And instead of having 2 different projects, really what Titanium encourages is having different directories or different views depending on what operating system you're working on. This is kind of an example of how you
require the correct module.
Right. So
as far as code management.
Once
yeah.
the app is compiled and submitted to an app store or whatever, why even bother having kind of like a joint application if there's going to be
It's basically so you can share your code and have the code reuse between the two. You can totally do that. You can split it up and have two completely different applications.
I'm not 100% certain of this, but I remember reading that there's a way to, like, based on the directory names, it'll actually exclude the JavaScript that's not needed. Or in some way, there's supposed to be a way that it will actually optimize the compiled results, so it only includes the JavaScript necessary for that platform.
Yeah, I believe it does do some pre-processing on your JavaScript and can detect things like that and throw out some of that stuff. But at the end of the day, your JavaScript files aren't big, and it's not much overhead that's getting packaged in your applications as well, because it's just these text files, and the parts you don't care about don't get executed, so it doesn't add a lot of bloat. This kind of checking the platforms and stuff like that, when we did our application, we did all of that stuff in app, and we required the right views for the right operating system, and then we created some that were kind of hybrids that would work on both, or some helper classes that would create, for example, modal windows. In iOS, it's really, really easy to throw up a window that kind of dims everything else out, and you touch anywhere else and it goes away, and you want a close button. In Android, it's not really as easy to get all that functionality, so we created a helper that you'd call this helper. On iOS, it would just immediately call the iOS version of the modal window, and on Android, it would do a bunch of other stuff to give the user experience that we wanted. So yeah, may not be the best in practice for a large app, but for a demo app, this is how you can check and do things differently based on what operating system you're working on. So we get down here, we have this click event, so we're listening for clicks on the rows in the view. That pops up the confirmation dialog if you want to change the status. And here we're looping through all the items out of the database. We can go into the database and loop through and populate that stuff. I don't want to spend the time going through all this code. You can look at it, play with it. It is, like I said, pretty self-explanatory as far as what's going on here. Jump over to add window. This gives a little bit of insight as far as actually adding the other components like text field, buttons. You can see there's these properties. With Titanium, they've made it easy, so all of their constructors, you can just pass in a JavaScript object with all the properties you want to set on it, instead of having to create it and then call set property over and over for these different things, or setting them all. You can do that additionally, but you can also just pass in an object and it will assign those when it creates them. So one thing I'm not going over here, Titanium has an MVC framework called Alloy that they promote a lot on their site. Another thing you can check out. They have some things that are nice in that their styling and the attributes of a lot of their views. You can use a CSS-esque kind of syntax if you're used to that, where it looks kind of like a style sheet, and you can have classes and things like that, so it's maybe a little bit more familiar to you if you're a web developer, and being able to work with it that way. There are some limitations with that. We ended up not using that, but it is there, and does make a lot of simple things even simpler. So here we go. A lot of these things, add event listener, you're used to that kind of syntax, passing in a callback function and getting an event back. A few gotchas that we ran into when working with Titanium. Events in Titanium are asynchronous. If you're familiar with JavaScript, you know that they're synchronous, and so we were expecting that. It's not the case. JavaScript events are still, because it's running in JavaScript. But when you're using events that call through their proxies to the native code, they are asynchronous. So watch out for that. Some things, when you're a heavy JavaScript developer and you're used to counting on that, it can really throw you for a loop.
Are there any plugins available to kind of counter that a little bit?
Not that I've seen. I didn't do a lot of looking into that. We just kind of, were aware of that and dealt with that in our code appropriately. They have there's some global events that you can fire in Titanium that aren't necessarily tied to any components, so you can basically send messages between your components and things like that.
The biggest problem people have with these issues when they're making network calls, right? Because you have to define callbacks. They do allow you to pass in whether or not to make that call synchronous and block on it, but I would just use the async stuff and learn callbacks. To build it correctly.
Yeah, and that's true. They do have. There's an HTTP client built in. So to do your familiar AJAX type requests, we ended up building kind of a wrapper around that gave it more of a jQuery type feel because that's what we were used to. But that's you can do it synchronous or asynchronous. Highly recommend asynchronous and using callbacks. One thing we discovered, cookies are not shared between the HTTP client and the web view on Android. So if you're planning to do anything with web views and making AJAX requests interacting with some existing web service, those are two different things. And it was kind of a nightmare to try to persist session information and things like that between there. On iOS, it persists and it works great, and you make a request and authenticate via AJAX, and then you can go to a web view and get authenticated stuff. And Android is not as friendly for that use case. The multi-column picker. So this is the iOS version of what a multi-column picker is. Now Android has a date and time picker natively that's good, and it works well. But when you're doing a custom one of these, don't do a multi-column one because it's a non-native implementation that's really, really terrible. It just is unusable. You can't select the thing you want, and we fought it for a long time until we realized the documentation said it was a non-native implementation. That explained why it was so terrible. Or use at your own risk, but I would not recommend it. Tips. So already talked about this first one a little bit. The documentation on Titanium's website is very good, especially reading over Windows and how iOS, BlackBerry, Android, how they deal with Windows. Like for example, Android has this concept of heavyweight and lightweight windows, which determines some things related to that, or the back button on Android devices, when it closes a window and when it doesn't. And windows are tied to activities, which was in our code sample there. Activities also can connect you to things like forgot the term. The drop up list, menu. There it is. The menu in Android, so you can add items to the menus based on what window you're looking at, things like that. The Android emulator is really slow. I'm sure several of you have used it before, but it's a pretty painful development process to be launching the emulator over and over. So get it. If you don't have an Android device, get one. If you're going to develop on Android, the emulator's there and it's free, but get a device. It's much, much nicer working on that. You can use the emulator when you're done and you're just testing it. If you need to test it on 10 or 20 different devices, if you can't get those devices. But with iOS, it's about 6s either way. The emulator is really fast and really nice. The real device is nice too. There are no problems there.
Is there any problem developing for iPad?
No, that's what we were doing. Okay. So all of our development was on iPad, and we were tested all on the Android tablets at a 7-inch and 10-inch and things like that. So, yeah.
Have you done much with dealing with the different resolutions?
Yes.
It's fairly easy with Android. You could be 1 or 2
Thank you. That's a very good point that I will add to this deck for later presentations, because resolutions can be very problematic with Android, like you says. In iOS, things work really well as far as Retina displays or not. In Android, there's this concept of there's regular resolutions and small and large and extra large and there's this weird things. Titanium has done some things that can help with that as far as the units go. You can set in the config file your default units, which you can use, pixels, or there's one that's called display, I forget what it stands for, DIP, D-I-P. Set that as your default unit and things will be much easier. That's not in there by default, and I don't know why, but it really should be, and that will just scale things according to the pixel density. So if you have the equivalent of a Retina density Android device, it will scale everything appropriately and it will look nice. You can specify those units whenever if we go back here, you'll see right here. So in these buttons, we have this width, height, top. It's using this DP. There you could specify DIP, so you can do 300 dip as a string. But if you want to just use numbers for all of your units, which we ended up doing, you can set that in the config. And if you don't specify the unit there, it will use whatever the default is in your config. I think by default it's pixels or something, but that was one thing. Very helpful. Dealing with icons and splash screens on Android is also a challenge, because there's all different, not just resolutions, but there's all the different screen sizes. So they've got some good documentation on their site on how to set that up with your directory structure, so that you have they have specific names that will load assets in from those directories based on the resolution of your device. If you've done iOS development, they have a suffix on their image files. It's at 2x to specify that's for a Retina display, and you provide a resource that's named the same thing with twice the resolution. It will use that one instead. In Android, it doesn't have the suffix like that, but you use different folders for the different resolution assets that you want to load. It gracefully falls back to whatever you have available if it can't find one for the resolution you want. But those things are outlined pretty well. There's some articles on their tutorials and their getting started stuff about packaging, deploying, the things you need like that, and how to set that up. It would be much better than something I could give in a presentation. So last thing, plan ahead. Get to know your operating system if you don't already, or operating systems you want to develop on. Understand what the best practices are. Go and read Apple's human interface guidelines for developing iOS. Same thing with Android.
What percentage of your market would you say is BlackBerry, or outside of your Android?
I don't know. They recently just added BlackBerry support to Titanium, so I haven't touched it at all. I have no idea what kind of a market share there is, and it probably depends on your application, right? For us, we're building a tablet application. Is there a BlackBerry tablet out there? I hope not. But, so get to know your market there.
Does the IDE have any problems running on Macbox?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, so the IDE works great in Linux, Windows, OS X. We haven't had any problems with it.
The problem is you obviously can't build for iOS unless you are on Mac hardware. So there are some cloud build servers that will allow you to just push your code up to their environment. They'll build for iOS for you.
No problem.
I see a lot of Windows laptops.
Yeah. Yeah, if you want to develop for iOS, you still need a Mac to do that.
Does the
guys support core data storage or just SQLite?
I don't know.
What's the question?
Does it support core data storage or just SQLite?
You can store core on the file system. They also have JSON DB, SQLite. You can do all sorts of things with storage, but you can store files directly on the file system.
But you're asking if you can use core data?
Core data is what I
Yes,
mean.
you can.
Isn't that what I thought it was? Yeah.
But yeah, get to know what you're doing. Get to know like I was saying, the best practices for your devices, how they typically work. I think going into it with the idea that you're going to build the same application for multiple operating systems is generally a bad idea, because they operate differently, they do things differently. Get to know that, figure out, plan out, wireframe up, mock up what you're going to do in iOS, Android, figure out the components that are going to be the same, the ones that are going to be the different. It's going to make a huge difference instead of sitting there tinkering with your code for hours and hours trying to figure out how to make it work. Coming at it with a good plan and knowing what you want to do on the different operating systems when it's different is going to help you a lot. It'll be invaluable. You first, and then.
Yeah, I noticed the screenshots for Android were sort of using their older styling. Is there a flag or something you can set to make it use the auto?
So the screenshots that I have were just using the default 4.2 emulator. I'm not sure what flags there are. You'd have to look into what there are for the Android emulator. I'm sure there's got to be all kinds of flags and things you can do.
Depend on the Android device you're running it on.
Yeah, and if you do it.
The emulators sometimes are shockingly behind on certain things.
Yeah.
You may not have considered that to be an important thing to emulate properly.
Yeah. So yeah, once again, if you have a device that is running the operating system, then you're going to see what it's going to look like on your targeting specific devices or specific versions of the operating system. The emulators are kind of funky with Android. That's probably just because I don't know what I'm doing with the emulators in Android, but.
Does it support Node?
What's that?
Does Titanium have support for Node?
Like you want to run a Node server within it?
Basically, yeah. Is that possible?
I don't think so.
Because you can't run like a server environment.
Yeah.
Because it's just JavaScript.
Yeah, I mean, you can run any JavaScript. You can use other libraries. Like it fully supports underscore. Basically any other JavaScript library. Obviously, interacting with the DOM isn't going to do anything, but any sort of utility libraries that you like to use in JavaScript, you can use it because it's just running JavaScript in the native JavaScript interpreter.
Quickly on helping respond to that, Node uses CommonJS for the require syntax, and Titanium uses the same one. So theoretically, as long as whatever library you're trying to run doesn't require something that's like specific to Node.js, it's probably fairly easy to port to Titanium. In theory, I've had problems with that. Wondering, have you played with their new Mvc framework at all?
I played with it a little bit when we started.
Anything you can tell us about it?
Well, just what I mentioned. Just what I mentioned earlier, that it provides some nice things that your styling, your attributes for all your UI components are in kind of a CSS-esque format. I forget what it's called. It's not really CSS, but is a little bit more familiar. So instead of having it in your code, all the style component, it helps you kind of separate out your style versus your actual components and functionality. Other than that, there were some limitations with it as far as being able to really have fine-grained control over some things, at least that we saw. That's why we ended up not using it, but it's there for a lot of simple applications. I think it's probably great, and you can start using it fast. And like I said, if you're familiar with web development, I think that's what they were going for, is trying to make it feel like you were kind of doing your HTML, because they have a tag. I think it's some sort of like XML-based markup that you have for your views and stuff like that to make it feel like web development.
So I'm a iOS developer, and my question is regarding will this save you time if you already know C Objective? What are the advantages and disadvantages of using these versus native Objective-C? That's a question that probably everybody has. Yeah.
So the advantages of writing in the native language, Objective-C or Java, is obviously you're going to get there's some weird bugs that Titanium has. You're not going to get any of the bugs that are you're getting passed through this third-party library. You may get slightly better performance. The main advantages with Titanium are that you can write in JavaScript, which tends to be a lot more concise than either Java or Objective-C. So your code base can be smaller. Once again, there's the reusability of your code. If you're developing for multiple platforms, you can reuse a large amount of your code between your applications, and maintenance is easier because of that. And
does it also depend on the kind of app you're developing? Like if it's IO heavy, you might be advantageous to use JavaScript. Anyway, if it's processing heavy, then maybe you're way better off just to stick with Objective-C.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you're doing a ton of processing, JavaScript is going to be slower than your compiled languages. So
one thing to note with that is it is possible to create native extensions that Titanium can use. It's a real pain in the neck, and finding the documentation for it is extremely difficult. But I was able to get a native extension working on both Android and iOS. It was the UI stuff that tripped me up later.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions? Yeah.
Does Titanium run in like a web view? Like I put a phone gap before and stuff like that. We're just basically running like a Safari type of web view. Is that what Titanium is basically doing, or is this kind of a native app and it's still allowing it to execute JavaScript code?
Yeah, so it's not doing that. That's one of the big differences between this and PhoneGap, is that it's executing JavaScript, but then all that JavaScript is calling into the native functionality to create native views. The only time you're seeing a web view is if you create a web view. So all of your components, everything that you see, is all native. So it's really a native app. Just the interface, I guess, that you get to it and create things and bind event listeners. That's all just from JavaScript through this proxy system that they have. This tries to illustrate that. But
as you start looking at it, you may get confused because prior to release 1.0, it did use a web view, and so people still reference that as why not to use Titanium. But that's been gone for a year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah.
Like you were saying, it is not a web view today.
Yeah.
What sells me on this is because before I'm giving I did a web view, and also I believe it didn't have Nitro, it didn't have some of the JavaScript engine, like Safari did, so everything was just really light. Performance was really bad. So I think I'm totally sold on this between calling native UI elements. That alone is amazing, and plus stuff to be able to do kind of a type of styling, like you were showing us that.
Yeah, that's why when we started out on our project, we looked at PhoneGap, we looked at doing it just natively in both, and came up with the conclusion was that Titanium was going to help us get there faster because we're all JavaScript programmers. Some of us know Java pretty well. No one knows Objective-C, and we just thought we could get going fast with this, and it worked really well, at least for iOS. There are a lot more snags you'll find with Android as you go, so be aware that there are other problems, things that just don't work as smoothly, but it is, I'm not sure you'd get away from those by doing it natively anyway. It's just part of Android, I think. So
you've been using Titanium for quite a while?
It hasn't been that long, probably 6 months or so.
Okay. It's been probably a little longer than that since I last tried to use it. One of the reasons I came here, even though I've obviously done a little bit with it, is I kind of wanted to see how you were approaching it. But I ran into a bunch of snags that I eventually gave up and did something different. I was just wondering if it seems like things have gotten more stable in the last year or so on the project to you, because I was running into issues where normal JavaScript libraries, like I had a modified version of Backbone that I used so I could use the event system, and the library code wasn't executing the same on the iOS devices or even on the Android devices. I was having different problems on each with the standard library code. I finally gave up. Have you run into any problems like that? Maybe those things have been fixed recently?
So we did run into one. There are some things, and I'm not sure whose fault it is, but we were using underscore, and in some of their, I forget, one of the functions in there, it checks the, I don't remember what it was, checking the length of the arguments or something like that you pass in, and when running in Titanium, it would fail in Android. Don't know why. I ended up actually modifying the source for underscore there. It was a quick fix, hard to track down, easy to fix. So there's some weird things that seem a little inconsistent, but I don't know how that would be a problem without being a problem with the native JavaScript.
I have been trying to customize things too much. Basically, I was trying to take the environment on Titanium to be as similar to the other JavaScript stack that I have as we could. And maybe I was just trying to do things. But that is one thing to be aware of if you're using it, is it seems that the JavaScript engines that are used do differ a little bit, which is really weird because I would think on Android it would actually be using V8. But
yeah, I'm not sure, but there are some. Certainly, we saw some kind of weird things like that with the JavaScript.
But I'm not the only one who's seen anything.
Yeah.
I was starting to wonder if I was crazy.
Yeah, no, there are some weird things with that, and it's. I'm not sure. Like I said, I don't know if it's their problem or if it's a problem with Android and their whatever it's running to execute the JavaScript. But anyway, here's this URL here. Hopefully, should have this presentation at it. I'm pretty sure I pushed it there. That's where you can get back at this if you want to review this. That's my email address. If you want to, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out, contact me, or you can, feel free to talk to me after this if you have other questions relating to that. I'm by no means an expert. Titanium is probably apparent, but it's been overall, I think, a great tool, a way to get going quickly, developing your mobile application, and in a relatively painless fashion. Painless, not pain-free. But anyway, that's all I've got unless there's other questions.